the Hermetic and Echemacy figures of Claudius de Domenico Celentano, Veilus Novi, from a manuscript written and illuminated at Naples AD 1606. No better way can be found of introducing to the royal art a seeker after the mysteries of symbolical philosophy than to place at his disposal an actual example of alchemical writing. The text of this manuscript is as enigmatic as are its diagrams, but to him who will meditate upon the profound significance of both, the deeper issues of mysticism in due time will be made clear. An unknown person through whose hands this manuscript passed wrote thus of it: "Because of its drawings and illustrated expositions, the manuscript is of preeminent importance to the Rosicrucians and the contemporary order of Freemasons. The first and larger part of the illustrations deals with the Hermetic philosophy, explaining its teachings and doctrines. Interspersed among these are portraits of great teachers and satirical representations of bunglers and their mistaken views. The systematically arranged part shows with wonderful clearness the color development of the alchemical processes from blue gold over black to white and rose. Throughout it, treats of the change in human beings and not of the making of gold. Ever upon the grade of black, the return into chaos from which new creations are possible, follows the grade of the neophytes, the new birth, which is often repeated with impressive lucidity. The black stage occurs as usual through fire. This unopened and unpublished manuscript belongs to the order of the most important precepts and documents of the Rosicrucians and Freemasons. A search through the museums and library collections of Germany has failed to reveal any item of even a similar character. In addition to the 26 leaves here reproduced, there are 10 bottles or retorts, each half filled with varicolored substances. These bottles can be so easily described that it is unnecessary to reproduce them. The first bottle, from the mouth of which issues a golden shrub with 3 blossoms, contains a bluish-gray liquid, the entire figure being called "Our Quicksilver." Under the vessel is a verse containing the significant words, "He will have white garments for black and then red." The second bottle, from the neck of which rise 4 golden flowers, also contains the bluish-gray substance termed quicksilver. Below the bottle is the admonition to make spirit of the body and grace of the gross, that the corporeal may become incorporeal. The third bottle is entirely black, save for a golden tree trunk, having 6 lopped-off branches, and terminating in 5 branches, which end in knobs and protrude from the neck of the bottle. The state of the substance is termed blackness showing through the head of the raven. Under the bottle occurs the statement that the tincture of the philosophers is hidden in the air like the soul in the human body. The fourth bottle is of the deepest blackness and is called the head of the raven. Nothing rises from the neck of the vessel, for the earth, its contents, is described as submerged in chaos. The bottom of the fifth bottle contains a bluish-gray spotted liquid, the upper part being filled with a brick-colored substance. Above are the words, "Sixth raven's head." Below is added, "At the bottom of the vessel, worms are born." The lower half of the sixth bottle is of a bluish-gray, the upper half black, the entire figure being termed seventh raven's head. A child is seated beside the bottle, concerning whom it is written, "This newly balm, black sun, is called elixir, and will be made perfectly white." The seventh bottle is black below and black spotted with red above. The process is thus described. Black blacker than black, for many divers colors will appear. Those black clouds will descend to the body whence they came, and the junction of body, soul, and spirit has been completed and turned to ashes. The eighth bottle is divided horizontally by a golden band, from which rises a golden stem ending in 5 leaves protruding from the neck of the bottle. The contents of the vessel are transparent, and it is written that the black clouds are past and the great whiteness has been completed. The ninth bottle, from the neck of which rises a golden white rose, is also partly filled with a transparent liquid. The rose is made to say, "He who blanches me makes me red." The 10th and last bottle represents the consummation of the great work. The lower half of the vessel is filled with the blood-red elixir, and from the neck rises a red rose with many petals and of extreme beauty. After declaring all the planets to have been present at the consummation of the great work, the author of the document concludes, "I gave to the master, spirit, so much silver and gold that can never be poor. In his dedication, the author and illustrator of the manuscript declares that he has set forth all the operations of the great work. He prays to the Holy Spirit that he may be included in the number of those who have pursued this most noble of the sciences, and that he may be set always in the path of righteousness. Exclusive of his own researches, the main sources of his information are said to be the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, Raymond Lully, and Arnold of Villanova. To protect themselves from the persecution of despotic theology, the medieval alchemists couched their philosophy in Christian terminology, although the great secrets of the art were derived largely from Egyptian or Arabian adepts. The Mohammedans were masters of the Hermetic secrets, and even the great Paracelsus secured from them the major part of his knowledge. In their manifestos, the Rosicrucians also disclose the Arabian source of their secret doctrine. Hence, it should be borne in mind that the relating of the alchemical teachings to biblical symbolism was a gesture of expediency. In their search of the scriptures for the arcana of Israel, the Kabbalists substantiated in great measure the alchemical interpretations of the Bible, for the soul of alchemy is one with that of Kabbalism. Both schools have a common end, being who concerned with the mystery of human regeneration, despite apparent discrepancies in their symbolism. The publication of this manuscript places at the student's disposal the most profound secrets of the Hermetic art. At first, the task of decipherment may seem hopeless, and the superficially minded will be tempted to scoff at the possibility of real knowledge being perpetuated in such unconventional fashion. The scoffer will not realize that one of the purposes of the document is to awaken ridicule and thus preserve more effectually its arcana from the profane. A few sheets, such as those here reproduced, represent the life work of one who has consecrated himself to the task of tearing aside the veil of the world virgin. Years of research and experimentation, days of incessant labor, nights of prayer and meditation, and at last comes the realization of accomplishment. This is the real story, told by the grotesque figures drawn so painstakingly upon the faded, worm-eaten pages. Those who have glimpsed the greater realities of being realize that the fundamental verities of life find at best only imperfect expression through physical symbols. Only those who have passed through the travail of spiritual birth can adequately comprehend and properly reverence the pathetic efforts to portray for others that knowledge necessarily locked within the heart of the one who knows. The Chemical Marriage. He self-admitted author of The Chemical Marriage, Johann Valentin Andreas, born in Württemberg in 1586, was 28 years of age when that work was first published. It was presumably written about 12 years prior to its publication, or when the author was 15 or 16 years old. The fact is almost incredible that one so young could produce a volume containing the wealth of symbolic thought and philosophy hidden between the lines of The Chemical Marriage. This book makes the earliest known reference to Christian Rosenkreuz and is generally regarded as the third of the series of original Rosicrucian manifestos. As a symbolic work, the book itself is hopelessly irreconcilable with the statements made by Andreas concerning it. The story of The Chemical Marriage relates in detail a series of incidents occurring to an aged man, presumably the Father C.R.C. of the Fama and Confessio. If Father C.R.C. was born in 1378, as stated in the Confessio, and is identical with the Christian Rosenkreuz of The Chemical Marriage, he was elevated to the dignity of a Knight of the Golden Stone in the 81st year of his life, 1459. In the light of his own statements, it is inconceivable that Andreae could have been Father Rosy Cross. Many figures found in the various books on symbolism published in the early part of the 17th century bear a striking resemblance to the characters and episodes in The Chemical Marriage. The alchemical wedding may prove to be the key to the riddle of Baconian Rosicrucianism. The presence in the German text of The Chemical Marriage of some words in English indicates its author to have been conversant also with that language. The following summary of the main episodes of the 7 days of The Chemical Marriage will give the reader a fairly comprehensive idea of the profundity of its symbolism. The first day. Christian Rosenkreuz, having prepared in his heart the paschal lamb, together with a small unleavened loaf, was disturbed while at prayer one evening before Easter by a violent storm, which threatened to demolish not only his little house, but the very hill on which it stood. In the midst of the tempest, he was touched on the back, and turning, he beheld a glorious woman with wings filled with eyes, and robed in sky-colored garments spangled with stars. In one hand she held a trumpet, and in the other a bundle of letters in every language. Handing a letter to CRC, she immediately ascended into the air, at the same time blowing upon her trumpet a blast which shook the house. Upon the seal of the letter was a curious cross and the words "In hoc signo vinces." Within, traced in letters of gold on an azure field, was an invitation to a royal wedding. CRC was deeply moved by the invitation because it was the fulfillment of a prophecy which he had received 7 years before, but so unworthy did he feel that he was paralyzed with fear. At length, after resorting to prayer, he sought sleep. In his dreams he found himself in a loathsome dungeon with a multitude of other men, all bound and fettered with great chains. The grievousness of their sufferings was increased as they stumbled over each other in the darkness. Suddenly, from above came the sound of trumpets. The cover of the dungeon was lifted, and a ray of light pierced the gloom. Framed in the light stood a hoary-headed man who announced that a rope would be lowered 7 times, and whoever could cling to the rope would be drawn up to freedom. Great confusion ensued. All sought to grasp the rope, and many were pulled away from it by others. CRC despaired of being saved, but suddenly the rope swung towards him, and grasping it, he was raised from the dungeon. An aged woman called the Ancient Matron wrote in a golden yellow book the names of those drawn forth, and each of the redeemed was given for remembrance a piece of gold bearing the symbol of the sun and the letters DLS. CRC, who had been injured while clinging to the rope, found it difficult to walk. The aged woman bade him not to worry, but to thank God who had permitted him to come into so high a light. Thereupon trumpets sounded, and CRC awoke, but so vivid was the dream that he was still sensible of the wounds received while asleep. With renewed faith, CRC arose and prepared himself for the Hermetic marriage. He donned a white linen coat and bound a red ribbon crosswise over his shoulders. In his hat he stuck 4 roses, and for food he carried bread, water, and salt. Before leaving his cottage, he knelt and vowed that whatever knowledge was revealed to him he would devote to the service of his neighbor. He then departed from his house with joy. The second day. As he entered the forest surrounding his little house, it seemed to CRC that all nature had joyously prepared for the wedding. As he proceeded singing merrily, he came to a green heath in which stood 3 great cedars, one bearing a tablet with an inscription describing the 4 paths that led to the palace of the king. The first short and dangerous, the second circuitous, the third a pleasant and royal road, and the 4th suitable only for incorruptible bodies. Weary and perplexed, CRC decided to rest, and cutting a slice of bread, was about to partake thereof, when a white dove begged it from him. The dove was at once attacked by a raven, and in his efforts to separate the birds, CRC unknowingly ran a considerable distance along one of the 4 paths, that leading southward. A terrific wind preventing him from retracing his steps, the wedding guest resigned himself to the loss of his bread and continued along the road until he espied in the distance a great gate. The sun being low, he hastened towards the portal, upon which, among other figures, was a tablet bearing the words Procul hinc procul et profani. A gatekeeper in sky-colored habit immediately asked CRC for his letter of invitation, and on receiving it, bade him enter and requested that he purchase a token. After describing himself as a brother of the Red Rosy Cross, CRC received in exchange for his water bottle a golden disc bearing the letters SC Night drawing near. The wanderer hastened on to a second gate, guarded by a lion, and to which was affixed a tablet with the words Date et Dabiter Volis, where he presented a letter given him by the first gatekeeper. Being urged to purchase a token bearing the letters SM, he gave his little package of salt and then hastened on to reach the palace gates before they were locked for the night. A beautiful virgin called Virgo Lucifera was extinguishing the castle lights as CRC approached, and he was barely able to squeeze through the closing gates. As they closed, they caught part of his coat, which he was forced to leave behind. Here his name was written in the Lord Bridegroom's little vellum book, and he was presented with a new pair of shoes, and also a token bearing the letters SPN. He was then conducted by pages to a small chamber where the ice-gray locks were cut from the crown of his head by invisible barbers, after which he was ushered into a spacious hall where a goodly number of kings, princes, and commoners were assembled. The third day. Soon after dawn the trumpets sounded, and the Virgo Lucifera, arrayed in red velvet, girded with a white sash, and crowned with a laurel wreath, entered accompanied by 200 men in red and white livery. She intimated to CRC and his 8 companions that they might fare better than the other, self-satisfied guests. Golden scales were then hung in the midst of the hall, and near them were placed 7 weights, 1 good-sized, 4 small, and 2 very large. The men in livery, each carrying a naked sword and a strong rope, were divided into 7 groups, and from each group was chosen a captain, who was given charge of one of the weights. Having remounted her high throne, Virgo Lucifera ordered the ceremony to begin. The first to step on the scales was an emperor so virtuous that the balances did not tip until 6 weights had been placed upon the opposite end. He was therefore turned over to the 6th group. The rich and poor alike stood upon the scales, but only a few passed the test successfully. To these were given velvet robes and wreaths of laurel, after which they were seated upon the steps of Virgo Lucifera's throne. Those who failed were ridiculed and scourged. The Inquisition being finished, one of the captains begged Virgo Lucifera to permit the 9 men who had declared themselves unworthy also to be weighed, and this caused CRC anguish and fear. Of the first 7, 1 succeeded and was greeted with joy. CRC was the 8th, and he not only withstood all the weights, but even when 3 men hung on the opposite end of the beam, he could not be moved. A page cried out, "That is he!" CRC was quickly set at liberty and permitted to release one of the captives. He chose the first emperor. Virgo Lucifera then requested the red roses that CRC carried, which he immediately gave her. The ceremony of the scales ended about 10 o'clock in the forenoon. After agreeing upon the penalties to be imposed upon those whose shortcomings had been thus exposed, a dinner was served to all. The few successful artists, including CRC, were given the chief seats, after which the golden fleece and a flying lion were bestowed upon them in the name of the bridegroom. Virgo Lucifera then presented a magnificent goblet to the guests, stating that the king had requested all to share its contents. Following this, CRC and his companions were taken out upon a scaffolding where they beheld the various penalties suffered by those who failed. Before leaving the palace, each of the rejected guests was given a draught of forgetfulness. The elect then returned to the castle, where to each was assigned a learned page, who conducted them through the various parts of the edifice. CRC saw many things his companions were not privileged to behold, including the royal sepulchre, where he learned more than is extant in all books. He also visited a magnificent library and an observatory containing a great globe 30 feet in diameter and with all the countries of the world marked upon it. At supper, the various guests propounded enigmas, and CRC solved the riddle which Virgo Lucifera asked concerning her own identity. Then entered the dining hall 2 youths and 6 virgins beautifully robed, followed by a 7th virgin wearing a coronet. The latter was called the Duchess and was mistaken for the Hermetic bride. The Duchess told CRC that he had received more than the others, therefore should make a greater return. The Duchess then asked each of the virgins to pick up one of the 7 weights which still remained in the great room. The 4th day. After washing and drinking in the garden from a fountain which bore several inscriptions, among them one reading, "Drink, brothers, and live," the guests, led by Virgo Lucifera, ascended the 365 steps of the royal winding stairs. The guests were given wreaths of laurel, and a curtain being raised, found themselves in the presence of the king and queen. CRC was awestruck by the glory of the throne room, and especially by the magnificence of the queen's robes, which were so dazzling that he could not gaze upon them. Each guest was presented to the king by one of the virgins, and after this ceremony, the Virgo Lucifera made a short speech in which she recited the achievements of the honest artists, and begged that each be questioned as to whether she had properly fulfilled her duty. Old Atlas then stepped forward and in the name of their royal majesties greeted the intrepid band of philosophers and assured Virgo Lucifera that she should receive a royal reward. The length of the throne room was 5 times its width. To the west was a great porch in which stood 3 thrones, the central one elevated. On each throne sat 2 persons. On the first an ancient king with a young consort, on the third a black king with a veiled matron beside him, and on the central throne 2 young persons over whose heads hung a large and costly crown, about which hovered a little Cupid, who shot his arrows first at the 2 lovers and then about the hall. Before the queen a book bound in black velvet lay on a small altar, on which were golden decorations. Beside this were a burning candle, a celestial globe, a small striking watch, a little crystal pipe from which ran a stream of clear blood-red liquor, and a skull with a white serpent crawling in and out of the orbits. After their presentations, the guests retired down the winding stairs to the great hall. The 5th day, rising at daybreak and entreating his page to show him other treasures of the palace, CRC was conducted down many steps to a great iron door bearing a curious inscription, which he carefully copied. Passing through, he found himself in the royal treasury, the light in which came entirely from some huge carbuncles. In the center stood the triangular sepulchre of Lady Venus. Lifting a copper door in the pavement, the page ushered CRC into a crypt where stood a great bed upon which, when his guide had raised the coverlets, CRC beheld the body of Venus. Led by his page, CRC then rejoined his companions, saying nothing to them of his experience. Virgo Lucifera, robed in black velvet and accompanied by her virgins, then led the guests out into the courtyard, where stood 6 coffins, each with 8 pallbearers. CRC was the only one of the group of artists who suspected the royal bodies were no longer in these coffins. The coffins were lowered into graves and great stones rolled over them. The Virgo Lucifera then made a short oration in which she exhorted each to assist in restoring the royal persons to life, declaring that they should journey with her to the Tower of Olympus, where the medicines necessary to the resurrection of the 6 royal persons could alone be found. CRC and his companions followed Virgo Lucifera to the seashore, where all embarked on 7 ships disposed according to a certain strange order. As the ships sailed across the lake and through a narrow channel into the open sea, they were attended by sirens, nymphs, and sea goddesses, who in honor of the wedding presented a great and beautiful pearl to the royal couple. When the ships came in sight of the Tower of Olympus, Virgo Lucifera ordered the discharge of cannon to signal their approach. Immediately a white flag appeared upon the tower, and a small gilded pinnace containing an ancient man, the warden of the tower, with his white-clad guards, came out to meet the ships. The 6th day. The next morning, the aged warden of the tower, after examining the work performed by the wedding guests in the laboratory and finding it satisfactory, caused ladders, ropes, and large wings to be brought forth, and addressed the assembled artists thus: "My dear sons, one of these 3 things must each of you this day constantly bear about with him." Lots were cast, and to CRC, much to his chagrin, fell a heavy ladder. Those who secured wings had them fastened to their backs so cunningly that it was impossible to detect that they were artificial. The aged warden then locked the artists in the lower room of the tower, but in a short time a round hole was uncovered in the ceiling, and Virgo Lucifera invited all to ascend. Those with wings flew at once through the opening. Those with ropes had many difficulties, while CRC, with his ladder, made reasonable speed. On the 2nd floor, the wedding guests, musicians, and Virgo Lucifera gathered about a fountain-like contrivance containing the bodies of the 6 royal persons. The 7th day. In the morning, Virgo Lucifera announced that each of the wedding guests had become a Knight of the Golden Stone. The aged warden then presented each man with a gold medal, bearing on one side the inscription At Nat Mai, and on the other, Turn Na F. The entire company returned in 12 ships to the king's palace. The flags on the vessels bore the signs of the Zodiac, and CRC sat under that of Libra. As they entered the lake, many ships met them, and the king and queen, together with their lords, ladies, and virgins, rode forth on a golden barge to greet the returning guests. Atlas then made a short oration in the king's behalf, also asking for the royal presence. In reply, the aged warden delivered to Cupid, who hovered about the royal pair, a small, curious-shaped casket. CRC and the old lord, each bearing a snow-white ensign with a red cross on it, rode in the carriage with the king. At the first gate stood the porter with blue clothes, who, upon seeing CRC, begged him to intercede with the king to release him from that post of servitude. The king replied that the porter was a famous astrologer who was forced to keep the gate as a punishment for the crime of having gazed upon Lady Venus reposing upon her couch. The king further declared that the porter could be released only when another was found who had committed the same crime. Upon hearing this, CRC's heart sank, for he realized himself to be the culprit, but he remained silent at that time. The newly created Knights of the Golden Stone were obliged to subscribe to 5 articles drawn up by His Royal Highness. 1. That they would ascribe their order only to God and his handmaid, nature. 2. That they should abominate all uncleanness and vice. 3. That they should always be ready to assist the worthy and needy. 4. That they should not use their knowledge and power for the attainment of worldly dignity. 5. That they should not desire to live longer than God had decreed. They were then duly installed as knights, which ceremony was ratified in a little chapel where CRC hung up his golden fleece and his hat for an eternal memorial, and here he inscribed the following: Summa scientia nihil scire, fr Christianus Rosenkreuz, equus ore lapidus, anno 1459. After the ceremony, CRC admitted that he was the one who had beheld Venus and consequently must become the porter of the gate. The king embraced him fondly, and he was assigned to a great room containing 3 beds, one for himself, one for the aged lord of the tower, and the third for old Atlas. The chemical marriage here comes to an abrupt end, leaving the impression that CRC was to assume his duties as porter on the following morning. The book ends in the middle of a sentence, with a note in italics presumably by the editor. Under the symbolism of an alchemical marriage, medieval philosophers concealed the secret system of spiritual culture, whereby they hoped to coordinate the disjecta membra of both the human and social organisms. Society, they maintained, was a threefold structure and had its analogy in the triune constitution of man. For as man consists of spirit, mind, and body, so society is made up of the church, the state, and the populace. The bigotry of the church, the tyranny of the state, and the fury of the mob are the 3 murderous agencies of society which seek to destroy truth, as recounted in the Masonic legend of Hiram Abiff. The first 6 days of the chemical marriage set forth the processes of philosophical creation through which every organism must pass. The 3 kings are the threefold spirit of man and their consorts, the corresponding vehicles of their expression in the lower world. The executioner is the mind, the higher part of which, symbolized by the head, is necessary to the achievement of the philosophical labor. Thus the parts of man, by the alchemists symbolized as planets and elements, when blended together according to a certain divine formula, result in the creation of 2 philosophic babes, which, fed upon the blood of the alchemical bird, become rulers of the world. From an ethical standpoint, the young king and queen, resurrected at the summit of the tower and ensouled by divine life, represent the forces of intelligence and love which must ultimately guide society. Intelligence and love are the 2 great ethical luminaries of the world and correspond to enlightened spirit and regenerated body. The bridegroom is reality, and the bride the regenerated being who attains perfection by becoming one with reality through a cosmic marriage, wherein the mortal part attains immortality by being united with its own immortal source. In the Hermetic marriage, divine and human consciousness are united in holy wedlock, and he in whom this sacred ceremony takes place is designated as Knight of the Golden Stone. He thereby becomes a divine philosophic diamond composed of the quintessence of his own 7-fold constitution. Such is the true interpretation of the mystical process of becoming a bride of the Lamb. The Lamb of God is signified by the golden fleece that Jason was forced to win before he could assume his kingship. The flying lion is illumined will, an absolute prerequisite to the achievement of the great work. The episode of weighing the souls of men has its parallel in the ceremony described in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The walled city entered by CRC represents the sanctuary of wisdom wherein dwell the real rulers of the world, the initiated philosophers. Like the ancient mysteries after which it was patterned, the Order of the Rose Cross possessed a secret ritual which was lived by the candidate for a prescribed number of years before he was eligible to the inner degrees of the society. The various floors of the Tower of Olympus represent the orbits of the planets. The ascent of the philosophers from one floor to another also parallels certain rituals of the Eleusinian mysteries and the rites of Mithras, wherein the candidate ascended the 7 rungs of a ladder or climbed the 7 steps of a pyramid in order to signify release from the influences of the planetary governors. Man becomes master of the 7 spheres only when he transmutes the impulses received from them. He who masters the 7 worlds and is reunited with the divine source of his own nature consummates the Hermetic marriage. Bacon, Shakespeare, and the Rosicrucians. He present consideration of the Bacon, Shakespeare, Rosicrucian controversy is undertaken not for the vain purpose of digging up dead men's bones, but rather in the hope that a critical analysis will aid in the rediscovery of that knowledge lost to the world since the oracles were silenced. It was W.F.C. Wigston who called the Bard of Avon Phantom Captain Shakespeare, the Rosicrucian Mask. This constitutes one of the most significant statements relating to the Bacon-Shakespeare controversy. It is quite evident that William Shakespeare could not, unaided, have produced the immortal writings bearing his name. He did not possess the necessary literary culture, for the town of Stratford where he was reared contained no school capable of imparting the higher forms of learning reflected in the writings ascribed to him. His parents were illiterate, and in his early life he evinced a total disregard for study. There are in existence but 6 known examples of Shakespeare's handwriting. All are signatures, and 3 of them are in his will. The scrawling, uncertain method of their execution stamps Shakespeare as unfamiliar with the use of a pen, and it is obvious either that he copied a signature prepared for him or that his hand was guided while he wrote. No autograph manuscripts of the Shakespearean plays or sonnets have been discovered, nor is there even a tradition concerning them, other than the fantastic and impossible statement appearing in the foreword of the Great Folio. A well-stocked library would be an essential part of the equipment of an author whose literary productions demonstrate him to be familiar with the literature of all ages. Yet there is no record that Shakespeare ever possessed a library, nor does he make any mention of books in his will. Commenting on the known illiteracy of Shakespeare's daughter Judith, who at 27 could only make her mark, Ignatius Donnelly declares it to be unbelievable that William Shakespeare, if he wrote the plays bearing his name, would have permitted his own daughter to reach womanhood and marry without being able to read one line of the writings that made her father wealthy and locally famous. The query also has been raised: where did William Shakespeare secure his knowledge of modern French, Italian, Spanish, and Danish, to say nothing of classical Latin and Greek? For, in spite of the rare discrimination with which Latin is used by the author of the Shakespearean plays, Ben Jonson, who knew Shakespeare intimately, declared that the Stratford actor understood small Latin and less Greek. Is it not also more than strange that no record exists of William Shakespeare's having ever played a leading role in the famous dramas he is supposed to have written or in others produced by the company of which he was a member? True, he may have owned a small interest in the Globe Theatre or Blackfriars, but apparently the height of his thespian achievements was the Ghost in Hamlet. In spite of his admitted avarice, Shakespeare seemingly made no effort during his lifetime to control or secure remuneration from the plays bearing his name, many of which were first published anonymously. As far as can be ascertained, none of his heirs were involved in any manner whatsoever in the printing of the first folio after his death, nor did they benefit financially therefrom. Had he been their author, Shakespeare's manuscripts and unpublished plays would certainly have constituted his most valued possessions, yet his will, while making special disposition of his second-best bed and his broad silver gilt bowl, neither mentions nor intimates that he possessed any literary productions whatsoever. While the folios and quartos usually are signed William Shakespeare, all the known autographs of the Stratford actor read William Shakespeare. Does this change in spelling contain any significance heretofore generally overlooked? Furthermore, if the publishers of the first Shakespearean folio revered their fellow actor as much as their claims in that volume would indicate, why did they, as if in ironical allusion to a hoax which they were perpetrating, place an evident caricature of him on the title page? Certain absurdities also in Shakespeare's private life are irreconcilable. While supposedly at the zenith of his literary career, he was actually engaged in buying malt, presumably for a brewing business. Also picture the immortal Shakespeare, the reputed author of The Merchant of Venice, as a moneylender. Yet among those against whom Shakespeare brought action to collect petty sums was a fellow townsman, one Philip Rogers, whom he sued for an unpaid loan of 2 shillings, or about 48 cents. In short, there is nothing known in the life of Shakespeare that would justify the literary excellence imputed to him. The philosophic ideals promulgated throughout the Shakespearean plays distinctly demonstrate their author to have been thoroughly familiar with certain doctrines and tenets peculiar to Rosicrucianism. In fact, the profundity of the Shakespearean productions stamps their creator as one of the Illuminati of the ages. Most of those seeking a solution for the Bacon-Shakespeare controversy have been intellectualists. Notwithstanding their scholarly attainments, they have overlooked the important part played by transcendentalism in the philosophic achievements of the ages. The mysteries of superphysics are inexplicable to the materialist, whose training does not equip him to estimate the extent of their ramifications and complexities. Yet, who but a Platonist, a Kabbalist, or a Pythagorean could have written The Tempest, Macbeth, Hamlet, or the tragedy of Cymbeline? Who but one deeply versed in Paracelsian lore could have conceived A Midsummer Night's Dream? Father of modem science, remodeler of modern law, editor of the Modem Bible, patron of modem democracy, and one of the founders of modern Freemasonry, Sir Francis Bacon was a man of many aims and purposes. He was a Rosicrucian, some have intimated the Rosicrucian, if not actually the illustrious Father CRC, referred to in the Rosicrucian manifestos. He was certainly a high initiate of the Rosicrucian order, and it is his activities in connection with this secret body that are of prime importance to students of symbolism, philosophy, and literature. The first edition of the King James Bible contains a cryptic Baconian headpiece. Did Bacon cryptographically conceal in the authorized Bible that which he dared not literally reveal in the text? The secret Rosicrucian key to mystic and Masonic Christianity. Sir Francis Bacon unquestionably possessed the range of general and philosophical knowledge necessary to write the Shakespearean plays and sonnets, for it is usually conceded that he was a composer, lawyer, and linguist. His chaplain, Dr. William Rawley, and Ben Jonson both attest his philosophic and poetic accomplishments. The former pays Bacon this remarkable tribute. I have been induced to think that if there were a beam of knowledge derived from God upon any man in these modern times, it was upon him. For though he was a great reader of books, yet he had not his knowledge from books, but from some grounds and notions from within himself. See Introduction to the Resuscitado. The cryptogram as a factor in symbolic philosophy. N treatise, which deals with symbolism, would be complete without a section devoted to the consideration of cryptograms. The use of ciphers has long been recognized as indispensable in military and diplomatic circles, but the modern world has overlooked the important role played by cryptography in literature and philosophy. If the art of deciphering cryptograms could be made popular, it would result in the discovery of much hitherto unsuspected wisdom possessed by both ancient and medieval philosophers. It would prove that many apparently verbose and rambling authors were wordy for the sake of concealing words. Ciphers are hidden in the most subtle manner. They may be concealed in the watermark of the paper upon which a book is printed. They may be bound into the covers of ancient books. They may be hidden under imperfect pagination. They may be extracted from the first letters of words or the first words of sentences. They may be artfully concealed in mathematical equations or in apparently unintelligible characters. They may be extracted from the jargon of clowns or revealed by heat as having been written in sympathetic ink. They may be word ciphers, letter ciphers, or apparently ambiguous statements whose meaning could be understood only by repeated careful readings. They may, he discovered, in the elaborately illuminated initial letters of early books, or they may be revealed by a process of counting words or letters. If those interested in Freemasonic research would give serious consideration to this subject, they might find in books and manuscripts of the 16th and 17th centuries the information necessary to bridge the gap in Masonic history that now exists between the mysteries of the ancient world and the craft masonry of the last 3 centuries. The arcana of the ancient mysteries were never revealed to the profane except through the media of symbols. Symbolism fulfilled the dual office of concealing the sacred truths from the uninitiated and revealing them to those qualified to understand the symbols. Forms are the symbols of formless divine principles. Symbolism is the language of nature. With reverence, the wise pierce the veil and with clearer vision contemplate the reality, but the ignorant, unable to distinguish between the false and the true, behold a universe of symbols. It may well be said of nature, the Great Mother, that she is ever tracing strange characters upon the surface of things, but only to her eldest and wisest sons as a reward for their faith and devotion does she reveal the cryptic alphabet, which is the key to the import of these tracings. The temples of the ancient mysteries evolved their own sacred languages, known only to their initiates, and never spoken save in the sanctuary. The illumined priests considered it sacrilege to discuss the sacred truths of the higher worlds or the divine verities of eternal nature in the same tongue as that used by the vulgar for wrangling and dissension. A sacred science must needs be couched in a sacred language. Secret alphabets also were invented, and whenever the secrets of the wise were committed to writing, characters meaningless to the uninformed were employed. Such forms of writing were called sacred or hermetic alphabets. Some, such as the famous angelic writing, are still retained in the higher degrees of Masonry. Secret alphabets were not entirely satisfactory, however, for although they rendered unintelligible the true nature of the writings, their very presence disclosed the fact of concealed information, which the priests also sought to conceal. Through patience or persecution, the keys to these alphabets were eventually acquired and the contents of the documents revealed to the unworthy. During the Middle Ages, scores of writers, members of secret political or religious organizations, published books containing ciphers. Secret writing became a fad. Every European court had its own diplomatic cipher, and the intelligentsia vied with one another in devising curious and complicated cryptograms. The literature of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries is permeated with ciphers, few of which have ever been decoded. Many of the magnificent scientific and philosophic intellects of this period dared not publish their findings because of the religious intolerance of their day. In order to preserve the fruitage of their intellectual labors for mankind, these pioneers of progress concealed their discoveries in ciphers, trusting that future generations, more kindly than their own, would discover and appreciate their learning. Many churchmen, it is interesting to note, used cryptograms, fearing excommunication or a worse fate should their scientific researches be suspected. Only recently, an intricate cipher of Roger Bacon's has been unraveled, revealing the fact that this early scientist was well versed in the cellular theory. Lecturing before the American Philosophical Society, Dr. William Romaine Newbold, who translated the cipher manuscript of the friar, declared, "There are drawings which so accurately portray the actual appearance of certain objects that it is difficult to resist the inference that Bacon had seen them with the microscope. These are spermatozoa, the body cells and the seminiferous tubes, the ova, with their nuclei distinctly indicated. There are 9 large drawings, of which one at least bears considerable resemblance to a certain stage of development of a fertilized cell." See Review of Reviews, July 1921. Had Roger Bacon failed to conceal this discovery under a complicated cipher, he would have been persecuted as a heretic and would probably have met the fate of other early liberal thinkers. In spite of the rapid progress made by science in the last 250 years, it still remains ignorant concerning many of the original discoveries made by medieval investigators. The only record of these important findings is that contained in the cryptograms of the volumes which they published. While many authors have written on the subject of cryptography, the books most valuable to students of philosophy and religion are Polygraphia and Steganographia by Trithemius, Abbot of Spanheim, Mercury, or the Secret and Swift Messenger by John Wilkins, Bishop of Chester, Cyclippus Egypticus, and other works by Athanasius Kircher, Society of Jesus, and Cryptomonidices et Cryptographus by Gustavus Cellinus. Freemasonic symbolism in several early Masonic manuscripts, for example, the Harleian, Sloane, Lansdowne, and Edinburgh Kilwinning. It is stated that the craft of initiated builders existed before the deluge, and that its members were employed in the building of the Tower of Babel. A Masonic constitution dated 1701 gives the following naive account of the origin of the sciences, arts, and crafts from which the major part of Masonic symbolism is derived. How this worthy science was first begun, I shall tell. Before Noah's flood, there was a man called Lamech, as it is written in the 4th chap of Gen. And this Lamech had 2 wives. The one was called Ada, and the other Zillah. By the first wife Ada he got 2 sons, the one called Jabal, and the other Jubal. And by the other wife Zillah he got a son and daughter. And the 4 children found the beginning of all crafts in the world. This Jabal was the elder son, and he found the craft of geometric, and he parted flocks, as of sheep and lambs in the fields, and first wrought houses of stone and tree, as it is noted in the chap aforesaid. And his brother Jubal found the craft of music, of songs, organs, and harp. The 3rd brother, Tubal-Cain, found out smith's craft to work iron and steel, and their sister Naamah found out the art of weaving. These children did know that God would take vengeance for sin, either by fire or water, wherefore they wrote these sciences, which they had found in 2 pillars of stone, that they might be found after the flood. The one stone was called marble, cannot burn with fire, and the other was called laturus, brass, that cannot drown in the water. The author of this constitution thereupon declares that one of these pillars was later discovered by Hermes, who communicated to mankind the secrets thereon inscribed. In his Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus writes that Adam had forewarned his descendants that sinful humanity would be destroyed by a deluge. In order to preserve their science and philosophy, the children of Seth therefore raised 2 pillars, one of brick and the other of stone, on which were inscribed the keys to their knowledge. The patriarch Enoch, whose name means the initiator, is evidently a personification of the sun, since he lived 365 years. He also constructed an underground temple consisting of 9 vaults, one beneath the other, placing in the deepest vault a triangular tablet of gold bearing upon it the absolute and ineffable name of deity. According to some accounts, Enoch made 2 golden deltas. The larger he placed upon the white cubical altar in the lowest vault, and the smaller he gave into the keeping of his son Methuselah, who did the actual construction work of the brick chambers according to the pattern revealed to his father by the Most High. In the form and arrangement of these vaults, Enoch epitomized the 9 spheres of the ancient mysteries and the 9 sacred strata of the earth through which the initiate must pass to reach the flaming spirit dwelling in its central core. According to Freemasonic symbolism, Enoch, fearing that all knowledge of the sacred mysteries would be lost at the time of the deluge, erected the 2 columns mentioned in the quotation. Upon the metal column, in appropriate allegorical symbols, he engraved the secret reaching, and upon the marble column placed an inscription stating that a short distance away, a priceless treasure would be discovered in a subterranean vault. After having thus faithfully completed his labors, Enoch was translated from the brow of Mount Moriah. In time, the location of the secret vaults was lost, but after the lapse of ages, there came another builder, an initiate, after the order of Enoch, and he, while laying the foundations for another temple to the great architect of the universe, discovered the long-lost vaults and the secrets contained within. The design of a temple depends on symmetry, the principles of which must be most carefully observed by the architect. They are due to proportion, indvakoia. Proportion is a correspondence among the measures of the members of an entire work and of the whole to a certain part selected as standard. From this result the principles of symmetry. Without symmetry and proportion, there can be no principles in the design of any temple. That is, if there is no precise relation between its members, as in the case of those of a well-shaped man. For the human body is so designed by nature that the face, from the chin to the top of the forehead and the lowest roots of the hair, is a tenth part of the whole height. The open hand from the wrist to the tip of the middle finger is just the same. The head from the chin to the crown is an eighth, and with the neck and shoulder from the top of the breast to the lowest roots of the hair is a sixth. From the middle of the breast to the summit of the crown is a fourth. If we take the height of the face itself, the distance from the bottom of the chin to the underside of the nostrils, and from that point to a line between the eyebrows is the same. From there to the lowest roots of the hair is also a third, comprising the forehead. The length of the foot is 1/6 of the height of the body, of the forearm 1/4, and the breadth of the breast is also 1/4. The other members, too, have their own symmetrical proportions, and it was by employing them that the famous painters and sculptors of antiquity attained to great and endless renown. The edifices raised by the Dionysiac builders were indeed sermons in stone. Though unable to comprehend fully the cosmic principles thus embodied in these masterpieces of human ingenuity and industry, even the uninitiated were invariably overwhelmed by the sense of majesty and symmetry resulting from the perfect coordination of pillars, spans, arches, and domes. By variations in the details of size, material, type, arrangement, ornamentation, and color, these inspired builders believed it possible to provoke in the nature of the onlooker certain distinct mental or emotional reactions. Vitruvius, for example, describes the disposition of bronze vases about a room so as to produce certain definite changes in the tone and quality of the human voice. In like manner, each chamber in the mysteries through which the candidate passed had its own peculiar acoustics. Thus, in one chamber, the voice of the priest was amplified until his words caused the very room to vibrate, while in another, the voice was diminished and softened to such a degree that it sounded like the distant tinkling of silver bells. Again, in some of the underground passageways, the candidate was apparently bereft of the power of speech, for though he shouted at the top of his voice, not even a whisper was audible to his ears. After progressing a few feet, however, he would discover that his softest sigh would be re-echoed 100 times. The supreme ambition of the Dionysiac architects was the construction of buildings which would create distinct impressions consistent with the purpose for which the structure itself was designed. In common with the Pythagoreans, they believed it possible by combinations of straight lines and curves to induce any desired mental attitude or emotion. They labored, therefore, to the end of producing a building perfectly harmonious with the structure of the universe itself. They may have even believed that an edifice so constructed, because it was in no respect at variance with any existing reality, would not be subject to dissolution, but would endure throughout the span of mortal time. Freemasonry's priceless heritage. The sanctum sanctorum of Freemasonry is ornamented with the Gnostic jewels of 1,000 ages. Its rituals ring with the divinely inspired words of seers and sages. 100 religious have brought their gifts of wisdom to its altar. Arts and sciences unnumbered have contributed to its symbolism. Freemasonry is a worldwide university, teaching the liberal arts and sciences of the soul to all who will hearken to its words. Its chairs are seats of learning, and its pillars uphold an arch of universal education. Its trestle boards are inscribed with the eternal verities of all ages, and upon those who comprehend its sacred depths has dawned the realization that within the Freemasonic mysteries lie hidden the long-lost arcana sought by all peoples since the genesis of human reason. The philosophic power of Freemasonry lies in its symbols, its priceless heritage from the mystery schools of antiquity. In a letter to Robert Freak Gould, Albert Pike writes, "It began to shape itself to my intellectual vision into something more imposing and majestic, solemnly mysterious and grand. It seemed to me like the pyramids in their loneliness, in whose yet undiscovered chambers may be hidden, for the enlightenment of coming generations, the sacred books of the Egyptians, so long lost to the world, like the Sphinx half buried in the desert. In its symbolism, which in its spirit of brotherhood are its essence, Freemasonry is more ancient than any of the world's living religions. It has the symbols and doctrines which, older than himself, Zarathustra inculcated, and he seemed to me a spectacle sublime yet pitiful, the ancient faith of our ancestors holding out to the world its symbols once so eloquent, and mutely and in vain asking for an interpreter. And so I came at last to see that the true greatness and majesty of Freemasonry consist in its proprietorship of these and its other symbols, and that its symbolism is its soul. Though the temples of Thebes and Karnak be now but majestic heaps of broken and time-battered stone, the spirit of Egyptian philosophy still marches triumphant through the centuries. Though the rock-hewn sanctuaries of the ancient Brahmins be now deserted and their carvings crumbled into dust, still the wisdom of the Vedas endures. Though the oracles be silenced and the house of the mysteries be now but rows of ghostly columns, still shines the spiritual glory of Hellas with luster undiminished. Though Zoroaster, Hermes, Pythagoras, Plato, and Aristotle are now but dim memories in a world once rocked by the transcendency of their intellectual genius, still in the mystic temple of Freemasonry, these god-men live again in their words and symbols, and the candidate, passing through the initiations, feels himself face to face with these illumined hierophants of days long past. Mystic Christianity. The true story of the life of Jesus of Nazareth has never been unfolded to the world, either in the accepted Gospels or in the Apocrypha, although a few stray hints may be found in some of the commentaries written by the ante-Nicene Fathers. The facts concerning his identity and mission are among the priceless mysteries preserved to this day in the secret vaults beneath the houses of the brethren. To a few of the Knights Templars, who were initiated into the arcana of the Druses, Nazarenes, Essenes, Johannites, and other sects still inhabiting the remote and inaccessible fastnesses of the Holy Land, part of the strange story was told. The knowledge of the Templars concerning the early history of Christianity was undoubtedly one of the main reasons for their persecution and final annihilation. The discrepancies in the writings of the early Church Fathers not only are irreconcilable, but demonstrate beyond question that even during the first 5 centuries after Christ, these learned men had for the basis of their writings little more substantial than folklore and hearsay. To the easy believer, everything is possible, and there are no problems. The unemotional person in search of facts, however, is confronted by a host of problems with uncertain factors, of which the following are typical. According to popular conception, Jesus was crucified during the 33rd year of his life and in the 3rd year of his ministry following his baptism. About AD 180, St. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, one of the most eminent of the ante-Nicene theologians, wrote Against Heresies, an attack on the doctrines of the Gnostics. In this work, Irenaeus declared upon the authority of the apostles themselves that Jesus lived to old age. To quote, "They, however, that they may establish their false opinion regarding that which is written, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, maintain that he preached for 1 year only, and then suffered in the 12th month." In speaking thus, they are forgetful of their own disadvantage, destroying his whole work, and robbing him of that age which is both more necessary and more honorable than any other. That more advanced age, I mean, during which also as a teacher he excelled all others. For how could he have had his disciples if he did not teach? And how could he have taught unless he had reached the age of a master? For when he came to be baptized, he had not yet completed his 30th year, but was beginning to be about 30 years of age, for thus Luke, who has mentioned his years, has expressed it. Now Jesus was, as it were, beginning to be 30 years old when he came to receive baptism. And, according to these men, he preached only 1 year reckoning from his baptism. On completing his 30th year, he suffered, being in fact still a young man, and who had by no means attained to advanced age. Now, that the first stage of early life embraces 30 years, and that this extends onward to the 40th year, everyone will admit But from the 40th and 50th year, a man begins to decline towards old age, which our Lord possessed, while he still fulfilled the office of a teacher, even as the gospel and all the elders testify, those who were conversant in Asia with John, the disciple of the Lord, affirming that John conveyed to them that information, and he remained among them up to the time of Trajan. Some of them, moreover, saw not only John, but the other apostles also, and heard the very same account from them, and bear testimony as to the validity of the statement. Whom then should we rather believe? Whether such men as these, or Telemsius, who never saw the apostles, and who never even in his dreams attained to the slightest trace of an apostle. Commenting on the foregoing passage, Godfrey Higgins remarks that it has fortunately escaped the hands of those destroyers who have attempted to render the gospel narratives consistent by deleting all such statements. He also notes that the doctrine of the crucifixion was a vexata question among Christians even during the 2nd century. The evidence of Irenaeus, he says, cannot be touched. On every principle of sound criticism and of the doctrine of probabilities, it is unimpeachable. It should further be noted that Irenaeus prepared this statement to contradict another, apparently current in his time, to the effect that the ministry of Jesus lasted but 1 year. Of all the early fathers, Irenaeus, writing within 80 years after the death of St. John the Evangelist, should have had reasonably accurate information. If the disciples themselves related that Jesus lived to advanced age in the body, why has the mysterious number 33 been arbitrarily chosen to symbolize the duration of his life? Were the incidents in the life of Jesus purposely altered so that his actions would fit more closely into the pattern established by the numerous savior gods who preceded him? That these analogies were recognized and used as a leverage in converting the Greeks and Romans is evident from a perusal of the writings of Justin Martyr, another 2nd century authority. In his apology, Justin addresses the pagans thus: "And when we say also that the Word, who is the first birth of God, was produced without sexual union, and that he, Jesus Christ, our teacher, was crucified and died, and rose again, and ascended into heaven, we propound nothing different from what you believe regarding those whom you esteem sons of Jupiter. And if we assert that the Word of God was born of God in a peculiar manner, different from ordinary generation, let this, as said above, be no extraordinary thing to you, who say that Mercury is the angelic Word of God. But if anyone objects that he was crucified, in this also he is on a par with those reputed sons of Jupiter of yours, who suffered as we have now enumerated." From this, it is evident that the first missionaries of the Christian Church were far more willing to admit the similarities between their faith and the faiths of the pagans than were their successors in later centuries. In an effort to solve some of the problems arising from any attempt to chronicle accurately the life of Jesus, it has been suggested that there may have lived in Syria at that time 2 or more religious teachers bearing the name Jesus, Jehoshua or Joshua, and that the lives of these men may have been confused in the gospel stories. In his Secret Sects of Syria and the Lebanon, Bernard H. Springett, a Masonic author, quotes from an early book, the name of which he was not at liberty to disclose because of its connection with the ritual of a sect. The last part of his quotation is germane to the subject at hand. "But Jehovah prospered the seed of the Essenians in holiness and love for many generations. Then came the chief of the angels, according to the commandment of God, to raise up an heir to the voice of Jehovah. And in 4 generations more, an heir was born, and named Joshua, and he was the child of Joseph and Mara, devout worshippers of Jehovah, who stood aloof from all other people save the Essenians. And this Joshua, in Nazareth, re-established Jehovah, and restored many of the lost rites and ceremonies. In the 36th year of his age, he was stoned to death in Jerusalem." Within the last century, several books have been published to supplement the meager descriptions in the Gospels of Jesus and his ministry. In some instances, these narratives claim to be founded upon early manuscripts recently discovered, in others, upon direct spiritual revelation. Some of these writings are highly plausible, while others are incredible. Although early Christianity shows every evidence of Oriental influence, this is a subject the Modem Church declines to discuss. If it is ever established beyond question that Jesus was an initiate of the pagan Greek or Asiatic mysteries, the effect upon the more conservative members of the Christian faith is likely to be cataclysmic. If Jesus was God incarnate, as the solemn councils of the Church discovered, why is he referred to in the New Testament as called of God and high prim after the order of Melchizedek? The words after the order make Jesus one of a line or order of which there must have been others of equal or even superior dignity. If the Melchizedeks were the divine or priestly rulers of the nations of the earth before the inauguration of the system of temporal rulers, then the statements attributed to Saint Paul would indicate that Jesus either was one of these philosophic elect or was attempting to reestablish their system of government. It will be remembered that Melchizedek also performed the same ceremony of the drinking of wine and the breaking of bread as did Jesus at the Last Supper. The Arthurian cycle and legend of the Holy Grail. According to legend, the body of the Christos, the spiritual law, was given into the keeping of two men, of whom the Gospels make but brief mention. These were Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, both devout men who, though not listed among the disciples or apostles of the Christos, were of all men chosen to be custodians of his sacred remains. Joseph of Arimathea was one of the initiated brethren and is called by A.E. Waite, in his A New Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, the first bishop of Christendom, just as the temporal or visible power of the Holy See was established by St. Peter. So the spiritual or invisible body of the faith was entrusted to the secret church of the Holy Grail through apostolic succession from Joseph of Arimathea, into whose keeping had been given the perpetual symbols of the covenant, the ever-flowing cup and the bleeding spear. In the Arthurian cycle appears a strange and mysterious figure, Merlin, the magician. In one of the legends concerning him, it is declared that when Jesus was sent to liberate the world from the bondage of evil, the adversary determined to send an antichrist to undo his labors. The devil, therefore, in the form of a horrible dragon, overshadowed a young woman who had taken refuge in sanctuary to escape the evil which had destroyed her family. When Merlin, her child, was born, he partook of the characteristics of his human mother and demon father. Merlin, however, did not serve the powers of darkness, but, being converted to the true light, retained only two of the supernatural powers inherited from his father, prophecy and miracle-working. The story of Merlin's infernal father must really be considered as an allegorical allusion to the fact that he was a philosophical son of the serpent or dragon, a title applied to all initiates of the mysteries, who thus acknowledge nature as their mortal mother and wisdom in the form of the serpent or dragon as their immortal father. Confusion of the dragon and serpent with the powers of evil has resulted as an inevitable consequence from misinterpretation of the early chapters of Genesis. The Cross and the Crucifixion. One of the most interesting legends concerning the cross is that preserved in Aurea Legenda by Jacobus de Vorgine. The story is to the effect that Adam, feeling the end of his life was near, entreated his son Seth to make a pilgrimage to the Garden of Eden and secure from the angel on guard at the entrance the oil of mercy which God had promised mankind. Seth did not know the way, but his father told him it was in an eastward direction, and the path would be easy to follow, for when Adam and Eve were banished from the garden of the Lord, upon the path which their feet had trod, the grass had never grown. Seth, following the directions of his father, discovered the Garden of Eden without difficulty. The angel who guarded the gate permitted him to enter, and in the midst of the garden, Seth beheld a great tree, the branches of which reached up to heaven. The tree was in the form of a cross, and stood on the brink of a precipice which led downward into the depths of hell. Among the roots of the tree he saw the body of his brother Cain, held prisoner by the entwining limbs. The angel refused to give Seth the oil of mercy, but presented him instead with 3 seeds from the tree of life, some say the tree of knowledge. With these, Seth returned to his father, who was so overjoyed that he did not desire to live longer. 3 days later, he died. And the 3 seeds were buried in his mouth, as the angel had instructed. The seeds became a sapling with 3 trunks in one, which absorbed into itself the blood of Adam, so that the life of Adam was in the tree. Noah dug up this tree by the roots and took it with him into the ark. After the waters subsided, he buried the skull of Adam under Mount Calvary and planted the tree on the summit of Mount Lebanon. Moses beheld a visionary being in the midst of this tree, the burning bush, and from it cut the magical rod with which he was able to bring water out of a stone. But because he failed to call upon the Lord the second time he struck the rock, he was not permitted to carry the sacred staff into the promised land, so he planted it in the hills of Moab. After much searching, King David discovered the tree, and his son, Solomon, tried to use it for a pillar in his temple, but his carpenters could not cut it so that it would fit. It was always either too long or too short. At last, disgusted, they cast it aside and used it for a bridge to connect Jerusalem with the surrounding hills. When the Queen of Sheba came to visit King Solomon, she was expected to walk across this bridge. Instead, when she beheld the tree, she refused to put her foot upon it, but, after kneeling and praying, removed her sandals and forded the stream. This so impressed King Solomon that he ordered the log to be overlaid with golden places and placed above the door of his temple. There it remained until his covetous grandson stole the gold and buried the tree so that the crime would not be discovered. From the ground where the tree was buried, there immediately bubbled forth a spring of water, which became known as Bethesda. To it, the sick from all Syria came to be healed. The angel of the pool became the guardian of the tree, and it remained undisturbed for many years. Eventually, the log floated to the surface and was used as a bridge again, this time between Calvary and Jerusalem, and over it Jesus passed to be crucified. There was no wood on Calvary, so the tree was cut into two parts to serve as the cross upon which the Son of Man was crucified. The cross was set up at the very spot where the skull of Adam had been buried. Later, when the cross was discovered by the Empress Helena, the wood was found to be of 4 different varieties contained in one tree, representing the elements. And thereafter, the cross continued to heal all the sick who were permitted to touch it. The lost libraries of Alexandria. Prior to the Christian era, 700,000 of the most valuable books, written upon parchment, papyrus, vellum, and wax, and also tablets of stone, terracotta, and wood, were gathered from all parts of the ancient world and housed in Alexandria, in buildings specially prepared for the purpose. This magnificent repository of knowledge was destroyed by a series of 3 fires. The parts that escaped the conflagration, lighted by Caesar to destroy the fleet in the harbor, were destroyed about AD 389 by the Christians in obedience to the Edict of Theodosius, who had ordered the destruction of the Serapeum, a building sacred to Serapis in which the volumes were kept. This conflagration is supposed to have destroyed the library that Marcus Antonius had presented to Cleopatra to compensate in part for that burned in the fire of the year 51. Concerning this, H.P. Blavatsky, in Isis Unveiled, has written, "They, the rabbis of Palestine and the wise men, say that not all the rolls and manuscripts reported in history to have been burned by Caesar, by the Christian mob, in 389, and by the Arab general Amru, perished as it is commonly believed, and the story they tell is the following. At the time of the contest for the throne, in 51 BC, between Cleopatra and her brother Dionysius Ptolemy, the Bruchian, which contained over 700,000 rolls, all bound in wood and fireproof parchment, was undergoing repairs, and a great portion of the original manuscripts, considered among the most precious, and which were not duplicated, were stored away in the house of one of the librarians. Several hours passed between the burning of the fleet, set on fire by Caesar's order, and the moment when the first buildings situated near the harbor caught fire in their turn, and the librarians, aided by several hundred slaves attached to the museum, succeeded in saving the most precious of the rolls. In all probability, the books which were saved lie buried either in Egypt or in India, and until they are discovered, the modern world must remain in ignorance concerning many great philosophical and mystical truths. The ancient world more clearly understood these missing links, the continuity of the pagan mysteries in Christianity. The cross in pagan symbolism. In his article on the cross and crucifixion in the Encyclopedia Britannica, Thomas McCall Fallow casts much light on the antiquity of this ideograph. The use of the cross as a religious symbol in pre-Christian times and among non-Christian peoples may probably be regarded as almost universal, and in very many cases it was connected with some form of nature worship. Not only is the cross itself a familiar object in the art of all nations, but the veneration for it is an essential part of the religious life of the greater part of humanity. It is a common symbol among the American Indians, North, Central, and South. William W. Seymour states, "The Aztec goddess of rain bore a cross in her hand, and the Toltecs claimed that their deity, Quetzalcoatl, taught them the sign and ritual of the cross. Hence his staff or scepter of power resembled a crosier, and his mantle was covered with red crosses." The cross in tradition, history, and art. The Tau cross. There are three distinct forms of the cross. The first is called the Tau, more correctly the Tav. It closely resembles the modern letter T, consisting of a horizontal bar resting on a vertical column, the two arms being of equal length. An oak tree cut off some feet above the ground, and its upper part laid across the lower in this form was the symbol of the Druid god Hu. It is suspected that this symbol originated among the Egyptians from the spread of the horns of a bull or ram, Taurus or Aries, and the vertical line of its face. This is sometimes designated as the hammer cross, because if held by its vertical base, it is not unlike a mallet or gavel. In one of the Kabbalistic Masonic legends, Hiram Abif is given a hammer in the form of a tau by his ancestor, Tubal-Cain. The Tau cross is preserved to modem masonry under the symbol of the T-square. This appears to be the oldest form of the cross extant. The Tau cross was inscribed on the forehead of every person admitted into the mysteries of Mithras. When a king was initiated into the Egyptian mysteries, the Tau was placed against his lips. It was tattooed upon the bodies of the candidates in some of the American Indian mysteries. To the Kabbalist, the Tau stood for heaven and the Pythagorean tetractys. The caduceus of Hermes was an outgrowth of the Tau cross, see Albert Pike. The crux ansata. The second type was that of a T, or Ta cross surmounted by a circle, often foreshortened to the form of an upright oval. This was called by the ancients the crux ansata, or the cross of life. It was the key to the mysteries of antiquity, and it probably gave rise to the more modern story of St. Peter's golden key to heaven. In the mysteries of Egypt, the candidate passed through all forms of actual and imaginary dangers, holding above his head the crux ansata, before which the powers of darkness fell back abashed. The student is reminded of the words in hoc signo vinces. The Tau form of the cross is not unlike the seal of Venus, as Richard Payne Knight has noted. He states, "The cross in this form is sometimes observable on coins, and several of them were found in a temple of Serapis, the Serapeum, demolished at the general destruction of those edifices by the Emperor Theodosius, and were said by the Christian antiquaries of that time to signify the future life." Man has four vehicles, or mediums of expression, by means of which the spiritual ego contacts the external universe: the physical nature, the vital nature, the emotional nature, and the mental nature. Each of these partakes in principle of one of the primary elements, and the four creatures assigned to them by the Kabbalists caused the cross to be symbolic of the compound nature of man. The Roman and Greek Catholic crosses. The third form of the cross is the familiar Roman or Greek type, which is closely associated with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, although it is improbable that the cross used resembled its more familiar modem form. There are unlimited sub-varieties of crosses, differing in the relative proportions of their vertical and horizontal sections. Among the secret orders of different generations, we find compounded crosses, such as the triple Tau in the Royal Arch of Freemasonry, and the double and triple crosses of both Masonic and Roman Catholic symbolism. To the Christian, the cross has a twofold significance. First, it is the symbol of the death of his Redeemer, through whose martyrdom he feels that he partakes of the glory of God. Secondly, it is the symbol of humility, patience, and the burden of life. It is interesting that the cross should be both a symbol of life and a symbol of death. The crucifixion, a cosmic allegory. Saviors unnumbered have died for the sins of man and by the hands of man, and through their deaths have interceded in heaven for the souls of their executioners. The martyrdom of the God-man and the redemption of the world through his blood has been an essential tenet of many great religions. Nearly all these stories can be traced to sun worship. For the glorious orb of day is the Savior who dies annually for every creature within his universe, but year after year rises again, victorious from the tomb of winter. Without doubt, the doctrine of the crucifixion is based upon the secret traditions of the ancient wisdom. It is a constant reminder that the divine nature of man is perpetually crucified upon the animal organism. Certain of the pagan mysteries included in the ceremony of initiation, the crucifixion of the candidate upon a cross, or the laying of his body upon a cruciform altar. It has been claimed that Apollonius of Tyana, the Antichrist, was initiated into the arcanum of Egypt in the Great Pyramid, where he hung upon a cross until unconscious and was then laid in the tomb, the coffer, for 3 days. While his body was unconscious, his soul was thought to pass into the realms of the immortals, the place of death. After it had vanquished death by recognizing that life is eternal, it returned again to the body, which then rose from the coffer, after which he was hailed as a brother by the priests, who believed that he had returned from the land of the dead. This concept was, in substance, the teaching of the mysteries. The crucified saviors. The list of the deathless mortals who suffered for man that he might receive the boon of eternal life is an imposing one. Among those connected historically or allegorically with the crucifixion are Prometheus, Adonis, Apollo, Eris, Bacchus, Krishna, Horns, Indra, Ixion, Mithras, Osiris, Pythagoras, Quetzalcoatl, Semiramis, and Jupiter. According to the fragmentary accounts extant, all these heroes gave their lives to the service of humanity and, with 1 or 2 exceptions, died as martyrs for the cause of human progress. In many mysterious ways, the manner of their death has been designedly concealed, but it is possible that most of them were crucified upon a cross or tree. The first friend of man, the immortal Prometheus, was crucified on the pinnacle of Mount Caucasus, and a vulture was placed over his liver to torment him throughout eternity by clawing and rending his flesh with its talons. Prometheus disobeyed the edict of Zeus by bringing fire and immortality to man, so for man he suffered until the coming of Hercules released him from his ages of torment. Concerning the crucifixion of the Persian Mithras, J.P. Lundy has written, Dupuy tells us that Mithra was put to death by crucifixion and rose again on the 25th of March. In the Persian mysteries, the body of a young man, apparently dead, was exhibited, which was feigned to be restored to life. By his sufferings he was believed to have worked their salvation, and on this account he was called their savior. His priests watched his tomb to the midnight of the vigil of the 25th of March, with loud cries, and in darkness, when all at once the light burst forth from all parts. The priest cried, Rejoice, O sacred initiated, your God is risen. His death, his pains, and sufferings have worked your salvation. See Monumental Christianity. The crucifixion of Quetzalcoatl. One of the most remarkable of the crucified world saviors is the Central American god of the winds, or the sun, Quetzalcoatl, concerning whose activities great secrecy was maintained by the Indian priests of Mexico and Central America. This strange immortal, whose name means feathered snake, appears to have come out of the sea, bringing with him a mysterious cross. On his garments were embellished clouds and red crosses. In his honor, great serpents carved from stone were placed in different parts of Mexico. The nails of the Passion. The 3 nails of the Passion have found their way into the symbolism of many races and faiths. There are many legends concerning these nails. One of these is to the effect that originally there were 4 nails, but one was dematerialized by a Hebrew Kabbalist and magician just as they were about to drive it through the foot of the master. Hence, it was necessary to cross the feet. Another legend relates that one of the nails was hammered into a crown and that it still exists as the imperial diadem of a European house. Still another story has it that the bit on the bridle of Constantine's horse was a passion nail. It is improbable, however, that the nails were made of iron, for at that time it was customary to use sharpened wooden pegs. Hargrave Jennings, in his Rosicrucians, Their Rites and Mysteries, calls attention to the fact that the mark or sign used in England to designate royal property and called the broad arrow is nothing more nor less than the 3 nails of the crucifixion grouped together, and that by placing them point to point, the ancient symbol of the Egyptian Tau cross, is formed. One of the most interesting interpretations of the crucifixion allegory is that which identifies the man Jesus with the personal consciousness of the individual. It is this personal consciousness that conceives of and dwells in the sense of separateness, and before the aspiring soul can be reunited with the ever-present and all-pervading Father, this personality must be sacrificed that the universal consciousness may be liberated. The mystery, the apocalypse. The presence of the temple of Diana at Ephesus marked that city as sacred to the mystery religion. For the 7 wonders of the ancient world were erected to indicate the repositories of recondite knowledge. Of Ephesus, H.P. Blavatsky writes, "It was a focus of the universal secret doctrines, the weird laboratory whence, fashioned in elegant Grecian phraseology, sprang the quintessence of Buddhistic, Zoroastrian, and Chaldean philosophy. Artemis, the gigantic concrete symbol of theosophico-pantheistic abstractions, the great mother multimamma, androgyne and patroness of the Ephesian writings, was conquered by Paul, but although the zealous converts of the apostles pretended to burn all their books on curious arts, isprospia, enough of these remained for them to study when their first zeal had cooled off. See Isis Unveiled." Being a great center of pagan learning, Ephesus has been the locale for many early Christian myths. The assertion has been made that it was the last domicile of the Virgin Mary, also that the tomb of St. John the Divine was located there. According to legend, St. John did not depart from this life in the usual manner, but, selecting his vault, entered it while still alive, and closing the entrance behind him, vanished forever from mortal sight. A rumor was current in ancient Ephesus that St. John would sleep in his tomb until the return of the Savior, and that when the apostle turned over on his sepulchral couch, the earth above moved like the coverlets of a bed. Subjected to more criticism than any other book now incorporated in the New Testament, the Apocalypse, popularly accredited to St. John the Divine, is by far the most important but least understood of the Gnostic Christian writings. Though Justin Martyr declared the Book of Revelation to have been written by John, one of Christ's apostles, its authorship was disputed as early as the 2nd century after Christ. In the 3rd century, these contentions became acute, and even Dionysius of Alexandria and Eusebius attacked the Johannine theory, declaring that both the Book of Revelation and the Gospel, according to St. John, were written by one Cerinthus, who borrowed the name of the great apostle the better to foist his own doctrines upon the Christians. Later, Jerome questioned the authorship of the Apocalypse, and during the Reformation, his objections were revived by Luther and Erasmus. The once generally accepted notion that the Book of Revelation was the actual record of a mystical experience occurring to St. John while that seer was in exile in the Isle of Parmos is now regarded with disfavor by more critical scholars. Other explanations have therefore been advanced to account for the symbolism permeating the volume and the original motive for its writing. The more reasonable of these theories may be summed up as follows. First, upon the weight of evidence furnished by its own contents, the Book of Revelation may well be pronounced a pagan writing, one of the sacred books of the Eleusinian or Phrygian mysteries. As a corollary, the real author of a work, setting forth the profundities of Egyptian and Greek mysticism, must have been an initiate himself and consequently obligated to write only in the symbolic language of the mysteries. Second, it is possible that the Book of Revelation was written to reconcile the seeming discrepancies between the early Christian and pagan religious philosophies. When the zealots of the primitive Christian church sought to Christianize pagandom, the pagan initiates retorted with a powerful effort to paganize Christianity. The Christians failed, but the pagans succeeded. With the decline of paganism, the initiated pagan hierophants transferred their base of operations to the new vehicle of primitive Christianity, adopting the symbols of the new cult to conceal those eternal verities which are ever the priceless possession of the wise. The Apocalypse shows clearly the resultant fusion of pagan and Christian symbolism and thus bears irrefutable evidence of the activities of these initiated minds operating through early Christianity. Third, The theory has been advanced that the Book of Revelation represents the attempt made by the unscrupulous members of a certain religious order to undermine the Christian mysteries by satirizing their philosophy. This nefarious end they hoped to attain by showing the new faith to be merely a restatement of the ancient pagan doctrines, by heaping ridicule upon Christianity, and by using its own symbols toward its disparagement. For example, the star which fell to earth, Reva, 10 to 11, could be construed to mean the Star of Bethlehem, and the bitterness of that star, called wormwood and which poisoned mankind, could signify the false teachings of the Christian Church. While the last theory has gained a certain measure of popularity, the profundity of the apocalypse leads the discerning reader to the inevitable conclusion that this is the least plausible of the three hypotheses. To those able to pierce the veil of its symbolism, the inspired source of the document requires no further corroborative evidence. In the final analysis, true philosophy can be limited by neither creed nor faction. In fact, it is incompatible with every artificial limitation of human thought. The question of the pagan or Christian origin of the Book of Revelation is consequently of little importance. The faith of Islam, representative of the attitude of Christendom toward Islam, till recent years at least, is Alexander Ross's postscript to the anglicized version, published in 1649, of Sieur du Rayer's French translation of the Quran. The author of the postscript directs the following invective against Muhammad and the Quran. Good reader, the great Arabian impostor now at last, after 1,000 years, is by the way of France arrived in England, and his Alcoran, or gallimaufry of errors, a brat as deformed as the parent, and as full of heresies as his scald head was of scurvy, hath learned to speak English. If you will take a brief view of the Alcoran, you shall find it a hodgepodge made up of these four ingredients. 1. Of contradictions. 2. Of blasphemy. 3. Of ridiculous fables. 4. Of lies. The accusation of blasphemy is emphasized against Muhammad because he affirmed that God, being unmarried, was incapable of having a son. The fallacious argument, however, is apparent from the prophet's own views of the nature of God as contained in the second surah of the Quran. To Allah God belongeth the east and the west. Therefore, whithersoever ye turn yourselves to pray, there is the face of Allah, for Allah is omnipresent and omniscient. They say, Allah hath begotten children. Allah forbid. To him belongeth whatever is in heaven and on earth. All is possessed by him, the creator of heaven and earth, and when he decreeth a thing, he only saith unto it, Be, and it is. In other words, the God of Islam has but to desire, and the object of that desire at once comes into being, whereas the God of Alexander Ross must proceed in accord with the laws of human generation. Muhammad, prophet of Islam, the desired of all nations, was born in Mecca, AD 570, and died in Medina, AD 632, or in the 11th year after the Hegira. Washington Irving thus describes the signs and wonders accompanying the birth of the prophet. His mother suffered none of the pangs of travail. At the moment of his coming into the world, a celestial light illumined the surrounding country, and the newborn child, raising his eyes to heaven, exclaimed, God is great, there is no God but God, and I am his prophet. Heaven and earth, we are assured, were agitated at his advent. The lake Sawa shrank back to its secret springs, leaving its borders dry, while the Tigris, bursting its bounds, overflowed the neighboring lands. The palace of Khosru, the king of Persia, shook on its foundations, and several of its towers were toppled to the earth. In the same eventful night, the sacred fire of Zoroaster, which, guarded by the Magi, had burned without interruption for upward of 1,000 years, was suddenly extinguished, and all the idols in the world fell down. See Mahomet and his successors. While the prophet was still but a toddling babe, the angel Gabriel, with 70 wings, came to him, and cutting open the child, withdrew the heart. This Gabriel cleansed of the black drop of original sin which is in every human heart because of the perfidy of Adam, and then returned the organ to its proper place in the prophet's body. See footnote in E. H. Palmer's translation of the Quran. In his youth, Muhammad traveled with the Meccan caravans, on one occasion acted as armor-bearer for his uncle, and spent a considerable time among the Bedouins, from whom he learned many of the religious and philosophic traditions of ancient Arabia. While traveling with his uncle, Abu Taleb, Muhammad contacted the Nestorian Christians, having encamped on a certain night near one of their monasteries. Here, the young prophet-to-be secured much of his information concerning the origin and doctrines of the Christian faith. With the passing years, Muhammad attained marked success in business, and when about 26 years old, married one of his employers, a wealthy widow nearly 15 years his senior. The widow, Khadija by name, was apparently somewhat mercenary, for, finding her young business manager most efficient, she resolved to retain him in that capacity for life. Khadija was a woman of exceptional mentality, and to her integrity and devotion must be ascribed the early success of the Islamic cause. By his marriage, Muhammad was elevated from a position of comparative poverty to one of great wealth and power, and so exemplary was his conduct that he became known throughout Mecca as the faithful and true. Muhammad would have lived and died an honored and respected Meccan had he not unhesitatingly sacrificed both his wealth and social position in the service of the God whose voice he heard while meditating in the cavern on Mount Hira in the month of Ramadan. Year after year, Muhammad climbed the rocky and desolate slopes of Mount Hira, since called Jebel Nur, the mountain of light, and here in his loneliness cried out to God to reveal anew the pure religion of Adam. That spiritual doctrine lost to mankind through the dissensions of religious factions. Khadija, solicitous over her husband's ascetic practices, which were impairing his physical health, sometimes accompanied him in his weary vigil, and with womanly intuition sensed the travail of his soul. At last, one night in his 40th year, as he lay upon the floor of the cavern, enveloped in his cloak, a great light burst upon him. Overcome with a sense of perfect peace and understanding in the blessedness of the celestial presence, he lost consciousness. When he came to himself again, the angel Gabriel stood before him, exhibiting a silken shawl with mysterious characters traced upon it. From these characters, Muhammad gained the basic doctrines later embodied in the Quran. Then Gabriel spoke in a clear and wonderful voice, declaring Muhammad to be the prophet of the living God. In awe and trembling, Muhammad hastened to Khadija, fearing the vision to have been inspired by the same evil spirits who served the pagan magicians so greatly despised by him. Khadija assured him that his own virtuous life would be his protection and that he need fear no evil. Thus reassured, the prophet awaited further visitations from Gabriel. When these did not come, however, such a despair filled his soul that he attempted self-destruction, only to be stopped in the very act of casting himself over a cliff by the sudden reappearance of Gabriel, who again assured the prophet that the revelations needed by his people would be given to him as necessity arose. American Indian symbolism. North American Indian is by nature a symbolist, a mystic, and a philosopher. Like most Aboriginal peoples, his soul was on rapport with the cosmic agencies manifesting about him. Not only did his Manitos control creation from their exalted seats above the clouds, but they also descended into the world of men and mingled with their red children. The gray clouds hanging over the horizon were the smoke from the calumets of the gods, who could build fires of petrified wood and use a comet for a flame. The American Indian peopled the forests, rivers, and sky with myriads of superphysical and invisible beings. There are legends of entire tribes of Indians who lived in lake bottoms, of races who were never seen in the daytime, but who, coming forth from their hidden caves, roamed the earth at night and waylaid unwary travelers. Also of bat Indians, with human bodies and bat-like wings, who lived in gloomy forests and inaccessible cliffs, and who slept hanging head downward from great branches and outcroppings of rock. The red man's philosophy of elemental creatures is apparently the outcome of his intimate contact with nature, whose inexplicable wonders become the generating cause of such metaphysical speculations. In common with the early Scandinavians, the Indians of North America considered the earth, the Great Mother, to be an intermediate plane, bounded above by a heavenly sphere, the dwelling place of the Great Spirit, and below by a dark and terrifying subterranean world, the abode of shadows and of submundane powers. Like the Chaldeans, they divided the interval between the surface of earth and heaven into various strata, one consisting of clouds, another of the paths of the heavenly bodies, and so on. The underworld was similarly divided, and like the Greek system, represented to the initiated the house of the lesser mysteries. Those creatures capable of functioning in two or more elements were considered as messengers between the spirits of these various planes. The abode of the dead was presumed to be in a distant place, in the heavens above, the earth below, the distant comers of the world, or across wide seas. Sometimes a river flows between the world of the dead and that of the living, in this respect paralleling Egyptian, Greek, and Christian theology. To the Indian, the number 4 has a peculiar sanctity, presumably because the Great Spirit created his universe in a square frame. This is suggestive of the veneration accorded the tetrad by the Pythagoreans, who held it to be a fitting symbol of the Creator. The legendary narratives of the strange adventures of intrepid heroes who, while in the physical body, penetrated the realms of the dead, prove beyond question the presence of mystery cults among the North American red men. Wherever the mysteries were established, they were recognized as the philosophic equivalents of death, for those passing through the rituals experienced all after-death conditions while still in the physical body. At the consummation of the ritual, the initiate actually gained the ability to pass in and out of his physical body at will. This is the philosophic foundation for the allegories of adventures in the Indian Shadowland or world of ghosts. From coast to coast, writes Hartley Burr Alexander, the sacred calumet is the Indian's altar, and its smoke is the proper offering to heaven. See Mythology of All Paces. In the notes on the same work is given the following description of the pipe ceremony. The master of ceremonies, again rising to his feet, filled and lighted the pipe of peace from his own fire. Drawing 3 whiffs, one after the other, he blew the first towards the zenith, the second towards the ground, and the third towards the sun. By the first act, he returned thanks to the Great Spirit for the preservation of his life during the past year and for being permitted to be present at this council. By the second, he returned thanks to his mother, the earth, for her various productions which had ministered to his sustenance. And by the third, he returned thanks to the sun for his never-failing light, ever shining upon all. It was necessary for the Indian to secure the red stone for his calumet from the pipestone quarry, where in some remote past the Great Spirit had come, and, after fashioning with his own hands a great pipe, had smoked it toward the 4 corners of creation, and thus instituted this most sacred ceremony. Scores of Indian tribes, some of them traveling thousands of miles, secured the sacred stone from this single quarry, where the mandate of the Great Spirit had decreed that eternal peace should reign. The Indian does not worship the sun. He rather regards this shining orb as an appropriate symbol of the great and good spirit who forever radiates life to his red children. In Indian symbolism, the serpent, especially the great serpent, corroborates other evidence pointing to the presence of the mysteries on the North American continent. The flying serpent is the Atlantean token of the initiate. The 7-headed snake represents the 7 great Atlantean islands, the cities of Cibola, and also the 7 great prehistoric schools of esoteric philosophy. The Popol Vuh, no other sacred book sets forth so completely as the Popol Vuh the initiatory rituals of a great school of mystical philosophy. This volume alone is sufficient to establish incontestably the philosophical excellence of the red race. The red children of the sun, writes James Morgan Price, do not worship the one God. For them that one God is absolutely impersonal, and all the forces emanated from that one God are personal. This is the exact reverse of the popular Western conception of a personal God and impersonal working forces in nature. Decide for yourself which of these beliefs is the more philosophical. These children of the sun adore the plumed serpent, who is the messenger of the sun. He was the god Quetzalcoatl in Mexico, Gucumatz in Quiche, and in Peru he was called Amaru. From the latter name comes our word America. Amaruca is literally translated, land of the plumed serpent. The priests of this god of peace, from their chief center in the Cordilleras, once ruled both Americas. All the red men who have remained true to the ancient religion are still under their sway. One of their strong centers was in Guatemala, and of their order was the author of the book called Popol Vuh. In the Quiche tongue, Gucumatz is the exact equivalent of Quetzalcoatl in the Nahuatl language. Quetzal, the bird of paradise; Coat, serpent, the the serpent veiled in plumes of the paradise bird. The mysteries of Xibalba. The princes of Xibalba, so the Popol Vuh recounts, sent their 4 owl messengers to Hunhun Apu and Vukub Hunhun Apu, ordering them to come at once to the place of initiation in the fastnesses of the Guatemalan mountains. Failing in the tests imposed by the princes of Xibalba, the 2 brothers, according to the ancient custom, paid with their lives for their shortcomings. Hunhun Apu and Vukub Hunhun Apu were buried together, but the head of Hunhun Apu was placed among the branches of the sacred calabash tree, which grew in the middle of the road leading to the awful mysteries of Xibalba. Immediately the calabash tree covered itself with fruit, and the head of Hunhun Apu showed itself no more, for it reunited itself with the other fruits of the calabash tree. Now Squick was the virgin daughter of Prince Kuchumakik. From her father she had learned of the marvelous calabash tree, and desiring to possess some of its fruit, she journeyed alone to the somber place where it grew. When Squick put forth her hand to pick the fruit of the tree, some saliva from the mouth of Hunhun Apu fell into it, and the head spoke to Squick, saying, "This saliva and froth is my posterity which I have just given you. Now my head will cease to speak, for it is only the head of a corpse, which has no more flesh." Following the admonitions of Hunhun Apu, the young girl returned to her home. Her father, Kuchumakik, later discovering that she was about to become a mother, questioned her concerning the father of her child. Squick replied that the child was begotten while she was gazing upon the head of Hunhun Apu in the calabash tree, and that she had known no man. Kuchumakik, refusing to believe her story, at the instigation of the princes of Xibalba, demanded her heart in an urn. Led away by her executioners, Squick pleaded with them to spare her life, which they agreed to do, substituting for her heart the fruit of a certain tree, rubber, whose sap was red and of the consistency of blood. When the princes of Xibalba placed the supposed heart upon the coals of the altar to be consumed, they were all amazed by the perfume which rose therefrom, for they did not know that they were burning the fruit of a fragrant plant. The mysteries and their emissaries did that divine knowledge which constituted the supreme possession of the pagan priest craft survive the destruction of their temples? Is it yet accessible to mankind, or does it lie buried beneath the rubbish of ages, entombed within the very sanctuaries that were once illuminated by its splendor? In Egypt, writes Origen, the philosophers have a sublime and secret knowledge respecting the nature of God. What did Julian imply when he spoke of the secret initiations into the sacred mysteries of the 7-rayed God who lifted souls to salvation through his own nature? Who were the blessed theurgists who understood them profundities concerning which Julian dared not speak? If this inner doctrine were always concealed from the masses, for whom a simpler code had been devised, is it not highly probable that the exponents of every aspect of modern civilization, philosophic, ethical, religious, and scientific, are ignorant of the true meaning of the very theories and tenets on which their beliefs are founded? Do the arts and sciences that the race has inherited from older nations conceal beneath their fair exterior a mystery so great that only the most illumined intellect can grasp its import? Such is undoubtedly the case. Albert Pike, who has gathered ample evidence of the excellence of the doctrines promulgated by the mysteries, supports his assertions by quoting from the writings of Clement of Alexandria, Plato, Epictetus, Proclus, Aristophanes, and Cicero, all of whom unite in lauding the high ideals of these institutions. From the unqualified testimony of such reputable authorities, no reasonable doubt can exist that the initiates of Greece, Egypt, and other ancient countries possessed the correct solution to those great cultural, intellectual, moral, and social problems which, in an unsolved state, confront the humanity of the 20th century. The reader must not interpret this statement to mean that antiquity had foreseen and analyzed every complexity of this generation, but rather that the mysteries had evolved a method whereby the mind was so trained in the fundamental verities of life that it was able to cope intelligently with any emergency which might arise. Thus, the reasoning faculties were organized by a simple process of mental culture, for it was asserted that where reason reigns supreme, inconsistency cannot exist. Wisdom, it was maintained, lifts man to the condition of godhood, a fact which explains the enigmatical statement that the mysteries transformed roaring beasts into divinities. The preeminence of any philosophical system can be determined only by the excellence of its products. The mysteries have demonstrated the superiority of their culture by giving to the world minds of such overwhelming greatness, souls of such beatific vision, and lives of such outstanding impeccability that even after the lapse of ages, the teachings of these individuals constitute the present spiritual, intellectual, and ethical standards of the race. The initiates of the various mystery schools of past ages form a veritable golden chain of supermen and superwomen connecting heaven and earth. They are the links of that Homeric golden chain with which Zeus boasted he could bind the several parts of the universe to the pinnacle of Olympus. The sons and daughters of Isis are indeed an illustrious line, founders of sciences and philosophies, patrons of arts and crafts, supporting by the transcendency of their divinely given power the structures of world religions erected to do them homage. Founders of doctrines which have molded the lives of uncounted generations, these initiate teachers bear witness to that spiritual culture which has always existed and always will exist as a divine institution in the world of men. Hypatia. Sitting in the chair of philosophy previously occupied by her father, Theon the mathematician, the immortal Hypatia was for many years the central figure in the Alexandrian school of Neoplatonism. Famed alike for the depth of her learning and the charm of her person, beloved by the citizens of Alexandria, and frequently consulted by the magistrates of that city, this noble woman stands out from the pages of history as the greatest of the pagan martyrs. A personal disciple of the magician Plutarch, and versed in the profundities of the Platonic school, Hypatia eclipsed in argument and public esteem every proponent of the Christian doctrines in northern Egypt. While her writings perished at the time of the burning of the Library of Alexandria by the Mohammedans, some hint of their nature may be gleaned from the statements of contemporaneous authors. Hypatia evidently wrote a commentary on the Arithmetic of Diophantus, another on the astronomical canon of Ptolemy, and a third on the conics of Apollonius of Perga. Synesius, bishop of Ptolemais, her devoted friend, wrote to Hypatia for assistance in the construction of an astrolabe and a hydroscope. Recognizing the transcendency of her intellect, the learned of many nations flocked to the academy where she lectured. The Comte di Cagliostro. The divine Cagliostro, one moment the idol of Paris, the next a lonely prisoner in a dungeon of the Inquisition, passed like a meteor across the face of France. According to his memoirs written by him during his confinement in the Bastille, Alessandro Cagliostro was born in Malta of a noble but unknown family. He was reared and educated in Arabia under the tutelage of Al-Totas, a man well-versed in several branches of philosophy and science, and also a master of the transcendental arts. While Cagliostro's biographers generally ridicule this account, they utterly fail to advance in its stead any logical solution for the source of his magnificent store of arcane knowledge. Branded as an impostor and a charlatan, his miracles declared to be legerdemain, and his very generosity suspected of an ulterior motive, the Comte de Cagliostro is undoubtedly the most calumniated man in modem history. The mistrust, writes W.H.K. Trowbridge, that mystery and magic always inspire made Cagliostro with his fantastic personality an easy target for calumny. After having been riddled with abuse till he was unrecognizable, prejudice, the foster child of calumny, proceeded to lynch him, so to speak. For over 100 years, his character has dangled on the gibbet of infamy, upon which the sbirri of tradition have inscribed a curse on any one who shall attempt to cut him down. His fate has been his fame. He is remembered in history, not so much for anything he did, as for what was done to him. See Cagliostro, the splendor and misery of a master of magic. The Comte. During the early part of the 18th century, there appeared in the diplomatic circles of Europe the most baffling personality of history, a man whose life was so near a synonym of mystery that the enigma of his true identity was as insolvable to his contemporaries as it has been to later investigators. The Comte de Saint-Germain was recognized as the outstanding scholar and linguist of his day. His versatile accomplishments extended from chemistry and history to poetry and music. He played several musical instruments with great skill, and among his numerous compositions was a short opera. He was also an artist of rare ability, and the remarkably luminous effects which he created on canvas are believed to have been the result of his mixing powdered mother of pearl with his pigments. He gained worldwide distinction for his ability to reproduce in his paintings the original luster of the precious stones appearing upon the costumes of his subjects. His linguistic proficiency verged on the supernatural. Episodes from American history. Many times the question has been asked, was Francis Bacon's vision of the New Atlantis a prophetic dream of the great civilization which was so soon to rise upon the soil of the New World? It cannot be doubted that the secret societies of Europe conspired to establish upon the American continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Two incidents in the early history of the United States evidence the influence of that silent body which has so long guided the destinies of peoples and religions. By them, nations are created as vehicles for the promulgation of ideals, and while nations are true to these ideals, they survive. When they vary from them, they vanish like the Atlantis of old, which had ceased to know the gods. In his admirable little treatise, Our Flag, Robert Allen Campbell revives the details of an obscure but most important episode of American history, the designing of the colonial flag of 1775. The account involves a mysterious man concerning whom no information is available other than that he was on familiar terms with both General George Washington and Dr. Benjamin Franklin. The following description of him is taken from Campbell's treatise. Little seems to have been known concerning this old gentleman, and in the materials from which this account is compiled, his name is not even once mentioned, for he is uniformly spoken of or referred to as the professor. He was evidently far beyond his 70 years, and he often referred to historical events of more than a century previous, just as if he had been a living witness of their occurrence. Still, he was erect, vigorous, and active, hale, hearty, and clear-minded, as strong and energetic every way as in the prime of his life. He was tall, of fine figure, perfectly easy, and very dignified in his manners, being at once courteous, gracious, and commanding. He was, for those times and considering the customs of the colonists, very peculiar in his method of living, for he ate no flesh, fowl, or fish. He never used for food any green thing, any roots, or anything unripe. He drank no liquor, wine, or ale, but confined his diet to cereals and their products, fruits that were ripened on the stem in the sun, nuts, mild tea, and the sweets of honey, sugar, or molasses. He was well educated, highly cultivated, of extensive as well as varied information, and very studious. He spent considerable of his time in the patient and persistent conning of a number of very rare old books and ancient manuscripts which he seemed to be deciphering, translating, or rewriting. These books and manuscripts, together with his own writings, he never showed to anyone, and he did not even mention them in his conversations with the family, except in the most casual way, and he always locked them up carefully in a large, old-fashioned, cubically shaped, iron-bound, heavy, oaken chest whenever he left his room, even for his meals. He took long and frequent walks alone, sat on the brows of the neighboring hills, or mused in the midst of the green and flower-gemmed meadows. He was fairly liberal, but in no way lavish, in spending his money, with which he was well supplied. He was a quiet, though a very genial and very interesting member of the family, and B was seemingly at home upon any and every topic coming up in conversation. He was, in short, one whom everyone would notice and respect, whom few would feel well acquainted with, and whom no one would presume to question concerning himself, as to whence he came, why he tarried, or whither he journeyed. Conclusion. Hilip, king of Macedon, ambitious to obtain the teacher who would be most capable of imparting the higher branches of learning to his 14-year-old son, Alexander, and wishing the prince to have for his mentor the most famous and learned of the great philosophers, decided to communicate with Aristotle. He dispatched the following letter to the Greek sage. Philip to Aristotle, health. Know that I have a son. I render the gods many thanks, not so much for his birth, as that he was born in your time. For I hope that being educated and instructed by you, he will become worthy of us both and the kingdom which he shall inherit." Accepting Philip's invitation, Aristotle journeyed to Macedon in the 4th year of the 108th Olympiad and remained for 8 years as the tutor of Alexander. The young prince's affection for his instructor became as great as that which he felt for his father. He said that his father had given him being, but that Aristotle had given him well-being. The basic principles of the ancient wisdom were imparted to Alexander the Great by Aristotle, and at the philosopher's feet the Macedonian youth came to realize the transcendency of Greek learning as it was personified in Plato's immortal disciple. Elevated by his illumined teacher to the threshold of the philosophic sphere, he beheld the world of the sages, the world that fate and the limitations of his own soul decreed he should not conquer. Aristotle, in his leisure hours, edited and annotated the Iliad of Homer and presented the finished volume to Alexander. This book the young conqueror so highly prized that he carried it with him on all his campaigns. At the time of his triumph over Darius, discovering among the spoils a magnificent, gem-studded casket of unguents, he dumped its contents upon the ground, declaring that at last he had found a case worthy of Aristotle's edition of the Iliad. While on his Asiatic campaign, Alexander learned that Aristotle had published one of his most prized discourses, an occurrence which deeply grieved the young king. So, to Aristotle, conqueror of the unknown, Alexander, conqueror of the known, sent this reproachful and pathetic an admission of the insufficiency of worldly pomp and power. Alexander to Aristotle, health, you were wrong in publishing those branches of science hitherto not to be acquired except from oral instruction. In what shall I excel others if the more profound knowledge I gain from you be communicated to all? For my part, I had rather surpass the majority of mankind in the sublimer branches of learning than in extent of power and dominion. Farewell. The receipt of this amazing letter caused no ripple in the placid life of Aristotle, who replied that although the discourse had been communicated to the multitudes, none who had not heard him deliver the lecture, who lacked spiritual comprehension, could understand its true import. A few short years, and Alexander the Great went the way of all flesh, and with his body crumbled the structure of empire erected upon his personality. 1 year later, Aristotle also passed into that greater world concerning whose mysteries he had so often discoursed with his disciples in the Lyceum. But, as Aristotle excelled Alexander in life, so he excelled him in death, for though his body mouldered in an obscure tomb, the great philosopher continued to live in his intellectual achievements. Age after age paid him grateful tribute, generation after generation pondered over his theorems, until by the sheer transcendency of his rational faculties, Aristotle, the master of those who know, as Dante has called him, became the actual conqueror of the very world which Alexander had sought to subdue with the sword. Thus, it is demonstrated that to capture a man, it is not sufficient to enslave his body. It is necessary to enlist his reason, that to free a man, it is not enough to strike the shackles from his limbs. His mind must be liberated from bondage to his own ignorance. Physical conquest must ever fail, for, generating hatred and dissension, it spurs the mind to the avenging of an outraged body. But all men are bound, whether willingly or unwillingly, to obey that intellect in which they recognize qualities and virtues superior to their own. That the philosophic culture of ancient Greece, Egypt, and India excelled that of the modern world must be admitted by all, even by the most confirmed of modernists. The golden era of Greek aesthetics, intellectualism, and ethics has never since been equaled. The true philosopher belongs to the most noble order of men. The nation or race which is blessed by possession of illumined thinkers is fortunate indeed, and its name shall be remembered for their sake. In the famous Pythagorean school at Crotona, philosophy was regarded as indispensable to the life of man. He who did not comprehend the dignity of the reasoning power could not properly be said to live. Therefore, when through innate perverseness a member either voluntarily withdrew or was forcibly ejected from the philosophic fraternity, a headstone was set up for him in the community graveyard. For he who had forsaken intellectual and ethical pursuits to re-enter the material sphere with its illusions of sense and false ambition was regarded as one dead to the sphere of reality. The life represented by the thraldom of the senses the Pythagoreans conceived to be spiritual death, while they regarded death to the sense world as spiritual life. Philosophy bestows life in that it reveals the dignity and purpose of living. Materiality bestows death in that it benumbs or clouds those faculties of the human soul which should be responsive to the enlivening impulses of creative thought and ennobling virtue. How inferior to these standards of remote days are the laws by which men live in the 20th century. Today man, a sublime creature with infinite capacity for self-improvement, in an effort to be true to false standards, turns from his birthright of understanding without realizing the consequences and plunges into the maelstrom of material illusion. The precious span of his earthly years he devotes to the pathetically futile effort to establish himself as an enduring power in a realm of unenduring things. Gradually, the memory of his life as a spiritual being vanishes from his objective mind, and he focuses all his partly awakened faculties upon the seething beehive of industry which he has come to consider the sole actuality. From the lofty heights of his selfhood, he slowly sinks into the gloomy depths of ephemerality. He falls to the level of the beast, and in brutish fashion mumbles the problems arising from his all too insufficient knowledge of the divine plan. Here, in the lurid turmoil of a great industrial, political, commercial inferno, men writhe in self-inflicted agony and, reaching out into the swirling mists, strive to clutch and hold the grotesque phantoms of success and power. Ignorant of the cause of life, ignorant of the purpose of life, ignorant of what lies beyond the mystery of death, yet possessing within himself the answer to it all, man is willing to sacrifice the beautiful, the true, and the good within and without upon the blood-stained altar of worldly ambition. The world of philosophy, that beautiful garden of thought wherein the sages dwell in the bond of fraternity, fades from view. In its place rises an empire of stone, steel, smoke, and hate. A world in which millions of creatures, potentially human, scurry to and fro in the desperate effort to exist and at the same time maintain the vast institution which they have erected and which, like some mighty juggernaut, is rumbling inevitably towards an unknown end. In this physical empire, which man erects in the vain belief that he can outshine the kingdom of the celestials, everything is changed to stone. Fascinated by the glitter of gain, man gazes at the Medusa-like face of greed and stands petrified. In this commercial age, science is concerned solely with the classification of physical knowledge and investigation of the temporal and illusionary parts of nature. Its so-called practical discoveries bind man, but more tightly with the bonds of physical limitation. Religion, too, has become materialistic. The beauty and dignity of faith is measured by huge piles of masonry, by tracts of real estate, or by the balance sheet. Philosophy, which connects heaven and earth like a mighty ladder, up the rungs of which the illumined of all ages have climbed into the living presence of reality. Even philosophy has become a prosaic and heterogeneous mass of conflicting notions. Its beauty, its dignity, its transcendency are no more. Like other branches of human thought, it has been made materialistic, practical, and its activities so directionalized that they may also contribute their part to the erection of this modern world of stone and steel. In the ranks of the so-called learned, there is rising up a new order of thinkers, which may best be termed the school of the worldly wise men. After arriving at the astounding conclusion that they are the intellectual salt of the earth, these gentlemen of letters have appointed themselves the final judges of all knowledge, both human and divine. This group affirms that all mystics must have been epileptic and most of the saints neurotic. It declares God to be a fabrication of primitive superstition, the universe to be intended for no particular purpose, immortality to be a figment of the imagination, and an outstanding individuality to be but a fortuitous combination of cells. Pythagoras is asserted to have suffered from a bean complex. Socrates was a notorious inebriate. St. Paul was subject to fits. Paracelsus was an infamous quack. The Comte de Cagliostro a mountebank, and the Comte de Saint-Germain the outstanding crook of history. What do the lofty concepts of the world's illumined saviors and sages have in common with these stunted, distorted products of the realism of this century? All over the world, men and women, ground down by the soulless cultural systems of today, are crying out for the return of the banished age of beauty and enlightenment, for something practical in the highest sense of the word. A few are beginning to realize that so-called civilization in its present form is at the vanishing point, that coldness, heartlessness, commercialism, and material efficiency are impractical, and only that which offers opportunity for the expression of love and ideality is truly worthwhile. All the world is seeking happiness, but knows not in what direction to search. Men must learn that happiness crowns the soul's quest for understanding. Only through the realization of infinite goodness and infinite accomplishment can the peace of the inner self be assured. In spite of man's geocentrism, there is something in the human mind that is reaching out to philosophy. The criers of the mysteries speak again, bidding all men welcome to the house of light. The great institution of materiality has failed. The false civilization built by man has turned, and like the monster of Frankenstein, is destroying its creator. Religion wanders aimlessly in the maze of theological speculation. Science batters itself impotently against the barriers of the unknown. Only transcendental philosophy knows the path. Only the illumined reason can carry the understanding part of man upward to the light. Only philosophy can teach man to be born well, to live well, to die well, and in perfect measure be born again. Into this band of the elect, those who have chosen the life of knowledge, of virtue, and of utility, the philosophers of the ages invite you. About the author, Manley Palmer Hall, March 18, 1901, August 29, 1990, was a Canadian-born author and mystic. He is perhaps most famous for his work, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, an encyclopedic outline of Masonic, Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and Rosicrucian symbolical philosophy, published in 1928 when he was 27 years old. He was made a Knight Patron of the Masonic Research Group of San Francisco in 1953, although he was not raised until 22nd of November 1954 into Jewel Lodge No. 374, San Francisco. He later received his 32 degrees in the Valley of San Francisco AASR S.J. In 1973, 47 years after writing The Secret Teachings of All Ages, Hall was recognized as a 33 degrees Mason, the highest honor conferred by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, at a ceremony held at PRS on December 8, 1973. In his over 70-year career, Hall delivered approximately 8,000 lectures in the United States and abroad, authored over 150 books and essays, and wrote countless magazine articles. In 1934, Hall founded the Philosophical Research Society, PRS, in Los Angeles, California, a nonprofit foundation dedicated to the study of religion, mythology, metaphysics, and the occult. PRS maintains a research library of over 50,000 volumes and also sells and publishes metaphysical and spiritual books, mostly those authored by Hall.